In early May of 2022, on a shattered stretch of road near the village of Stary Soltiv in Ukraine's Kharkiv region, a column of Russian armor rolled forward with one of the most advanced tanks on the planet leading the way, the T-90M. This was Moscow's showpiece, a modern main battle tank with a new turret, a digital fire control system, and layers of reactive armor bolted across its hull. Russian state media had all but declared it untouchable and a direct counter to Western armor. But Ukrainian territorial defense fighters, most of them not even career soldiers, didn't appear to have received that memo. In a blink and you'll miss it attack, the T-90M was left a burning wreck, thanks to a weapon that's basically a metal tube barely a meter long, firing an unguided shell that cost around $3,000 per round, and based on a design that first entered service in 1948. This is the Swedish-made Carl Gustaf recoilless rifle, known in the US as the M3 Multi-Role Anti-Armor Anti-Personnel Weapon System, or MORS. So let's see how an 80-year-old recoilless rifle keeps turning Russia's best armor into scrap, and how that's slowly rewriting modern warfare doctrine. Now, the rifle was just one piece in a moving puzzle when the pivotal shot was taken. According to a post on X by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, the territorial defense troops first cut off the infantry escorting the tank with machine gun fire, then hit the vehicle with an RPG-7, which seemed to have jammed its turret. Only then did the Carl Gustaf finish the job. Expert analysts have noted that the decisive blow may have been the detonation of the tank's own ammunition. One open-source assessment even raised the possibility that the crippled tank was finished off by Russians to keep it from being captured. Either way, the Ukrainians were pleased enough with the results that they included a thank you in their post to the Swedish King Carl XVI Gustaf and his people for the weapon. Think about it. A cheap, shoulder-fired Swedish bazooka-like tube was the weapon Ukraine used to put down one of Russia's most expensive tanks. In fact, within days, a second T-90M was reported destroyed the same way near the same town. Now, if we zoom out from that single engagement, the pattern only sharpens. Over the course of the war, open-source trackers such as the Oryx project have visually documented well over 150 T-90M losses by July 2026, alongside thousands of older Russian tanks. And while no single weapon can claim that tally, the shoulder-fired anti-armor systems handed to Ukraine sit near the center of it. The doctrine that made them lethal wasn't complicated, which is precisely why it worked. Rather than meet Russian armored columns head-on, Ukrainian infantry dispersed into small teams and waited at the choke points that armor cannot avoid, the tree lines, the bridges, the narrow approaches into towns. They let the vehicles enter, struck from the flank or the rear where even a modern tank is vulnerable, and left the area before the counterfire arrived. The Carl Gustaf was built for exactly this kind of fight, because a tank on a road is rarely alone. Because infantry shelters behind it. The launcher fires a high-explosive anti-tank or heat round into the vehicle, detonating a fragmentation round that blasts into the men walking behind the tank. One weapon, two categories of target, seconds apart. The actual source on the effectiveness of these weapons comes from none other than Ukrainian troops on the ground, who were interviewed for Ukrainian military news outlets. Ukrainian gunners talk about loading out with just 5 rounds, 4 carried by an assistant and 1 by the gunner. They insist that 5 is usually enough, because a weapon this accurate doesn't need a truckload of ammunition, just the right shell and the discipline to wait for the shot. They talk about preferring the simple mechanical sight over the optical one in the chaos of combat, because the optic needs alignment, and alignment takes time they don't have. They talk about the 2-man drill, one soldier shouldering the tube while the other loads from behind, and about the hard rule that nobody stands within 2 meters of the rear when it's fired, because what comes out of the back of a recoilless weapon can kill. The Ukrainians also spoke about the weight almost in passing, which is even more impressive than it first seems. The M2 Carl Gustaf, which was arguably the originally widespread model back from the 1960s, weighed 14.2 kilograms. Its successor, the M3, which is what seems to have initially been shipped to Ukraine from Canada, cut that down to 10 kilograms, and the newest design, the M4, weighs only 6.6 kilograms, a third less than the previous model. To understand why this weapon works, we have to start with one key word in its name that is often omitted: recoilless. When a conventional cannon fires a heavy shell, the recoil would break a human shoulder. The Carl Gustaf solves that with physics rather than electronics. At the instant of firing, a carefully calculated portion of the propellant gas is vented through the rear of the tube from a cone-shaped nozzle. That rearward blast generates a counter-thrust that almost cancels the forward momentum of the projectile, which allows a single soldier to shoulder what is effectively a man-portable cannon and feel little more than a firm shove forward when it fires. But that same elegant solution carries a tactical price that could be becoming more important every year. The rearward blast throws up a violent signature of dust, flame, and overpressure, and it creates a lethal danger zone directly behind the gunner. On a battlefield increasingly watched by drones and thermal cameras, that backblast is a flare that announces exactly where the shooter is, which is why crews are drilled to fire and immediately displace. The recoilless principle is what makes the weapon possible, and also what makes surviving with it a matter of moving fast. The second design choice that sets the Carl Gustaf apart from nearly everything in its class is that the barrel itself is rifled or bored. This means the barrel is cut with spiral grooves that spin the projectile as it leaves the tube, stabilizing it in flight the way a spin stabilizes a thrown football or a rifle bullet. This goes against the grain of almost every comparable shoulder weapon of the last century, including the American bazooka, the German Panzerschreck, and the ubiquitous Soviet RPG, which landed that eponymous first hit on the tank in 2022. These rocket launchers are smoothbore and rely on the ammunition itself having fins to steady themselves and reach the target. Even the more modern variations of anti-tank weapons usually adopt the smoothbore design. The US used the M72 Law disposable rocket launcher for decades before introducing the AT-4, another Swedish-designed disposable recoilless launcher which gradually took over many of the heavier anti-armor roles while the Law remained in service. But the spinning projectile, combined with a recoilless system that lets the round carry far more propellant, means that Carl Gustaf gains much more velocity and accuracy at range. Some comparisons put the Carl Gustaf's projectiles leaving the tube at speeds several times higher than a rocket launcher. In practice, Carl Gustaf's accuracy and range are put between 600 and 700 meters, with an experienced gunner reaching well beyond that against a large stationary target. But the differences only start mounting from there, and you'll notice that we frequently refer to modern launchers as being disposable. This isn't accidental, as the most common anti-armor designs required a disposable launcher as a trade-off of shrinking the apparatus so it can be operated by infantry alone. This applied not only to smaller AT-4, but even the bigger Anglo-Swedish N-Law, which itself has garnered respect for its service in the war. It's only when we reach the Javelin that the system becomes semi-reusable. The Javelin is a single-use missile fitted inside its launch tube in the factory, and the entire contraption is fitted onto the Command Launch Unit, or CLU, which is what the human gunner actually operates. The CLU contains the optics and guidance package that zeroes in on the target, and the Javelin then takes over the actual targeting and allows the gunner to retreat for a true fire and forget. The Carl Gustaf achieves comparable battlefield flexibility in a very different way. Rather than relying on guided missiles, it combines a reusable launcher with a wide variety of specialized ammunition. This ties into the roughly $20,000 price tag of the weapon, depending on the contract, and why it's been so important. That is the cost of the actual launcher, but the cost of the munitions varies from only $500 to just under $3,000, and this depends on the specs of the munitions. By contrast, the Javelin CLU costs well over $100,000, and the cost of a single Javelin missile in tube assembly is between $160,000 and $170,000. It essentially makes a Javelin's cost overkill, even if you have to use multiple Carl Gustafs to take down a single tank. Which brings us to the real reason the Carl Gustaf has outlived every weapon meant to replace it. The astonishing library of ammunition that the 84mm rifle can use, and it's here where the specifics matter. Against armor, the workhorse is the Heat 551 and its improved 551C variant, a rocket-assisted anti-tank round which is effective out to around 700 meters, the same as the rifle's nominal range. More importantly, the round can punch through roughly 40 centimeters of steel. And against a modern tank wrapped in reactive armor, the gunner can switch to the tandem warhead Heat 751, in which a small precursor charge detonates the reactive armor plating first, clearing a path so the main shape charge can pierce into the hull beneath. This broadens the round's penetration to over 50 centimeters of armor, and that's behind the reactive plating. And for the necessities of constricted urban combat, there's even a confined space round, the Heat 655, which uses a saltwater countermass instead of pure gas to reduce the backblast enough that the weapon can be fired from inside a room, a capability that ordinary recoilless weapons simply can't offer without killing the crew. It basically allows for the creation of an anti-tank sniper from a vantage in or on a regular building. Now, beyond armor, the ammunition family reads like an entire infantry support company compressed into one tube. The HEDP 502 is a dual-purpose round that will crack light armor, brick and bunkers, with a fuse the gunner can set to burst on impact or an instant later to detonate inside a wall. The ASM 509 is a dedicated anti-structure munition for collapsing buildings and fortifications, while the MT 756 uses a tandem charge to punch into a fortified position and kill what's sheltering inside. The ADM 401 packs over 1,000 fletchets for close-range defense against infantry in the open. The high-explosive HE 441 family lobs fragmentation out a kilometer away and can be set to airburst above troops in a trench, with the most recent development being the 441E or 448 round that was announced back in 2022 to be delivered across the globe for users like the US Armed Forces and Sweden's NATO neighbours. There are even smoke rounds to screen a movement and illumination rounds to light a night sky. And at the far edge of that development roadmap is the guided multi-purpose munition, a laser-guided projectile developed jointly by Saab and Raytheon that promises to strike moving targets out to around 2.5 kilometers, dragging this analog weapon toward genuine precision. And even the price is more reasonable, expected to land in the $80,000 range, roughly half of the Javelin, all the while achieving similar penetrative capabilities while offering precision guidance through laser designation. So, a Javelin kills tanks and occasionally fortified positions. The Carl Gustaf is the closest thing the infantry has to a universal answer. Now, if you want to check out more weapons development from Sweden, the US, or any other major military power, make sure to subscribe to The Military Show. We cover weapons of all sorts and how they're actively being used in real combat in Ukraine and beyond. Back to the Carl Gustaf. It's important to underscore that while the weapon's efficiency lies in its versatility and reusability, it still suffers from a few limitations. The older Heat rounds struggle badly against the thick composite and reactive armor on the front of a modern main battle tank, which is exactly why the successful engagements in Ukraine so consistently come from the flank, the rear and the top, and why the tandem rounds exist at all. That flexibility to use seemingly mismatched munitions and combine them with near fire-and-forget capabilities, quick reloads, and ease of use is what's kept the rifle relevant through 8 decades of armor evolution. And this is precisely why the Carl Gustaf sits as one of the only remaining man-portable rifle recoilless rifles in existence. Sweden's first attempt at a shoulder-fired recoilless weapon, a 20mm anti-tank rifle from the early 1940s, was a cautionary tale. It was a design that could barely scratch the armor of late war tanks and was built in only small numbers. The lesson from this failure was that while you could build and sustain a recoilless anti-armor rifle, you had a harder time making the actual munitions score a kill. A small solid slug was no longer enough to down a tank from up front, and you increasingly needed a larger shaped charge warhead. So, in 1946, designers scaled the concept up to 84mm, large enough to carry a proper shaped charge, and in 1948, the weapon entered Swedish service. From there, it simply refused to age out. It first saw combat with Swedish UN forces in the Congo in the early 1960s. In the 1982 Falklands War, British Royal Marines used Carl Gustafs to help cripple an Argentine corvette, knocking out its missile launchers. The M2 of the 1960s gave way to the M3 of the 1990s, and in 2014 to the ultralight M4, using titanium components and carbon fiber construction to reduce weight, good for thousands of rounds where the M2 barrel lasted approximately 500 rounds, while the M4 barrel lifespan was roughly 1,000 rounds. The clearest measure of how thoroughly this weapon has entrenched itself in modern combat is the sheer list of its operators, as what began as a Swedish national weapon is now fielded in some form by more than 40 countries. The United States itself is a case study of how the Swedish design overtook even domestic weapons of what's arguably the largest and most prominent weapons developer in the world. American special operators embraced the reloadable Carl Gustaf decades ago. The regular army put the M3 into service in 2014, and by the following year, the goal was at least one in every infantry platoon, with the lighter M4 following soon after. Then the war in Ukraine turned a steady business into a stampede. Poland signed what Saab called its largest ground combat contract ever in 2024, worth around $1.2 billion, and all of it went toward Carl Gustaf rifles, ammunition and training. Japan, Lithuania and the Baltic states lined up behind it. That same year, Saab broke ground on a dedicated factory in India, its first fully owned production site outside Sweden, and moved to expand ammunition output. Sweden spent hundreds of millions of dollars replacing the roughly 500,000 rounds that had flowed to Ukraine and to the Allies, backfilling their own donations. An 80-year-old weapon doesn't get consumed at that scale unless it's genuinely useful. Which brings us to the more recent developments on the list, the aforementioned round called the HE-448, paired with a fire-controlled device designated the FCD-558. On its own, the HE-448 is a highly explosive round, and its alternate name as the HE-441E in the US suggests it's a direct improvement over the older HE-41 anti-personnel shell. It packs around 4,000 tungsten pellets for denser, deadlier fragmentation and better effect against enemies wearing body armor. What makes it different is that it can talk to the launcher. When chambered, the round and its surrounding tube report their own propellant temperature. The gunner then enters the range to target and selects either direct impact or airburst, and a small ballistic computer calculates an optimal firing, communicating with the fuse through a data protocol Saab calls Firebolt. Paired this way, the round can reportedly reach targets beyond 1.5 kilometers away and detonate precisely above a trench, a wall, or a machine gun nest, spraying fragmentation down onto enemies behind cover. Thus, the oldest complaint about the Carl Gustaf was that it was still a dumb tube, flying straight into whatever is in front of it, but that's arguably been engineered away. This anti-trench capability also leads to a few interesting theories around how the weapon is being used in Ukraine in 2026. The two hardest problems Ukrainian infantry face are enemy troops dug into trench lines and armored vehicles advancing across open ground. But both are exactly what a programmable airburst round is built to defeat. A heat round is wasted on them, and a direct fire shot forces the gunner into a long exposed line of sight, a duel he may lose. An airburst detonating above the trench from more than a kilometer away is a fundamentally different and safer proposition. Against dispersed infantry, it can substitute for artillery. So, if the weapon is already deployed, the HE-448 and its fire-controlled device give Ukrainian squads a portable, precise counter-infantry capability that meaningfully changes what a single anti-tank team can do. It's a product of the weapon's design and the shape of the fighting, and it doesn't require us to speculate about who asked for it. But there's another possible solution, which is far more covert and brutal. Saab described the HE-448 development on the basis of close customer relationships and feedback, language it repeats across its own materials. The earliest press release from that claim came in May 2022, and the Swedish Armed Forces started receiving the rounds in December 2021. This is too late to consider the round to be developed in the trenches of Ukraine. However, the more recent HE-758 actually fits the bill. Announced in May 2026, the Heat 758 is a tandem anti-tank round, and crucially, it's the successor to the Heat 751, which was actually credited for Carl Gustaf kills of Russian T-90Ms. This is where the feedback loop stops being a marketing phrase and becomes something you can actually trace. Ukrainian crews had already proven the Heat 751 against Russian T-90s, fitted with Contact 5 and Relict reactive armor, the exact protection Moscow bolts onto its best tanks. Saab took those results and went looking for a round that could defeat not just one Russian armor package, but all of them. But rather than iterate by hand, Saab's engineers used machine learning across 50,000 precursor designs, hunting for a configuration that would defeat every known Russian reactive armor. The result was a non-initiating precursor, a charge that strips away the reactive plating without setting it off, clearing a path for a main charge that punches through up to 70 centimeters of armor. As a reminder, the early design could punch through 50 centimeters. And according to coverage of the launch, Saab acknowledged that earlier performance of the Carl Gustaf in Ukraine actively shaped the new round's development. So that's the development loop Sweden is using. A Ukrainian gunner fires a Carl Gustaf round into a Russian tank. The reactive armor on that tank and on the ones that survive becomes data. That data becomes simulations in Sweden. And if we step back far enough, the Carl Gustaf is just a small part of a bigger shift. Sweden has become one of the arms suppliers the Western world can no longer do without. Today, it exports the Gripen fighter, the NLAW, and the AT-4 anti-armor weapons, the Carl Gustaf, and starting in 2026, even the systems that watch the sky. The latest development came in July 2026, when NATO announced at a summit in Ankara that it would open negotiations to replace its Cold War-era AWACS radar planes, the alliance's aging eyes in the sky. The winning system was Saab's Global Eye, a surveillance aircraft built on a business jet, chosen over Boeing's E-7 Wedgetail in a deal valued at up to $4.5 billion for as many as 10 aircraft, backed by 11 member states. NATO's leadership turned to the Swedish planes as they were built for the threats that now define this era, drone swarms and cruise missiles, and framed the choice around a Europe increasingly determined to build its own industrial base rather than depend on what they believe is now an unpredictable American government and its foreign policy. Which brings us back to the beginning, where we discussed that Carl Gustaf wasn't solely responsible for that pivotal T-90M kill. Increasingly, small reconnaissance drones do the target finding, loitering over a tree line to spot a dug-in position or a vehicle that a ground team could never see from behind cover. The drone crews then cue the anti-armor crew to engage with a single well-placed round. In that division of labor, the pairing plays to the strengths of each. The drone is cheap but more expendable for reconnaissance, and the tube packs the firepower at a higher cost. A programmable airburst round like the HE-448 makes the combination even deadlier, because a drone can confirm exactly where the enemy is sheltering, and the gunner can set the shell to detonate directly above them. So while the concept behind the weapon might be decades old, the drone may be actually extending its life further rather than replacing it, letting each cover the other's weakness. But even then, the simple Carl Gustaf is far from the only reason Russia has been losing tanks left and right, and you can check out the extent of the damage, and why even replacements aren't enough, in this video. And to learn more, subscribe to the Military Show, turn on notifications, and we'll see you in the next one.